Well, okay, so this is, I can actually slow down a bit because normally I do this talk in I did it the other day in 20 minutes, which was remarkable. Normally I do it in 40. Hopefully Kieran's going to pop up at the end, or possibly Shannon at the end, to come and ask some questions if there's some extra time. But this is a talk essentially about my passion. So we've just had where we were talking about taking control of our own RE, taking control of our own CPD, and kind of this talk condenses a lot of the things I've been thinking about for the past year and years before that. So to give you a bit of background about myself, I began teaching and I trained to be a teacher in Oxford as a secondary religious education teacher, having studied theology at university. So it's always been a bit of an interest of mine. And I found that I loved the RE element. I loved the curriculum element of it. I didn't really get on with the idea of being a teacher of teenagers. And so I left secondary and went into primary, and kind of a lot of people who are involved in TDAPE were part of that process for me, of going into primary, which was really exciting, convincing me that it was a really great, interesting place to teach. And then I've been able to develop my interest in RE through the primary lens. So at the end of this talk, I'm going to look at some examples that I've planned for RE that kind of put into real life some of the more abstract things that I talk about at the beginning of the talk. And they are both, so I think one example is Key Stage 3, but they're mostly Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2. When we talk about curriculum, these are three things that I think we want our curriculum to be. And this one's a bit cliche now, a bit old hat, but we want our curriculum to be knowledge rich. Okay, fine. We want our curriculum to be meaning rich. And a lot of the beginning of this talk is about the difference between those two things, because a knowledge rich curriculum is fine, but it could just be a knowledge organizer, or it could be some information that's laid out on a page. It could be a list of facts that people have to know that's in planning. Meaning rich is how we plug those into the much wider scheme of thinking, and that could be personal, so it could be kind of your own sense of what RE means, or linking it with history and other things, or it could be where it fits within our curriculum, or it could be where it fits within a wider, what I'll get onto later, a cultural schema. And saying that, we want our curriculum to be culture rich. So we don't want it to be detached from what's happening outside the classroom, but we want it to pick and choose those things that are the most beautiful, those things that are the most interesting, those things that are the most commonly held to be beautiful and interesting, because that's not an uncontested or easy to come by term. And I don't just think this is RE. I think this can go for history, this can go for English, this can go for maths, any of this. It needs to be knowledge rich, it needs to be meaning rich, and culture rich is maybe more specific to RE, but it means it needs to be linked in with the real world of meaning and culture and shared experience. Knowledge. Okay, well, knowledge is obvious, isn't it? It's just facts, it's just things we need to know. Knowledge, when we teach it, if it's going to be useful, if it's going to be something that is purposeful in our curriculum, then it needs to be linked to a discipline, and to a subject, and to a culture. And often in teaching, those first two are one and the same. So a discipline might be something like how we do history, or the kind of the procedural knowledge behind history, and the subject would be history as it's recognised in the school. RE, I'll come on to talk about how they're not the same, how RE is a genuinely multidisciplinary subject, because it draws, if you think about disciplines, are more kind of what you would do at university, or what you might find if you went in a big Waterstones. They're kind of those bodies of knowledge that exist outside of school. And then a subject is how we distill that and make it accessible for students and make sense of it as part of a school education. So how does RE as a subject make sense is actually a much more difficult question than how does geography, geography's a bad example, how does English, also a bad example because they're quite complex, but anyway, how do they make sense as a subject? So this is from a really amazing book. This is from this is from an article based on Michael Young's book, Knowledge and the Future School. Kind of, this is where the idea of powerful knowledge comes from. And then in 2020, he wrote an article called From Powerful Knowledge to the Powers of Knowledge, which kind of did a little bit of what Chris was doing earlier, where it picked up on his earlier work and said, well, here's how I would change things or make things different. So he says, what is powerful knowledge? Well, the big and in many ways controversial and quite political idea behind powerful knowledge is that there is better knowledge, and those little apostrophes, not called apostrophes, are they quotation marks, are doing some massively heavy lifting there, because that word better is so contested, both on an individual level, cultural level, institutional level, whatever it is. But anyway, we're just going to use it. There is better knowledge in different fields that we refer to as powerful knowledge. And all students, not just those identified as having academic ability, have the right to acquire this knowledge. One of my favourite arguments for this kind of curriculum that I'm advocating for is that, yes, it has always been taught in elite schools, or some version of it, or something similar to it, has always been taught in Eton, Harrow and Westminster and whichever school. But what we're advocating for is that this curriculum is taught in the school that I used to go to in Great Yarmouth, on the edge of a suburban estate, with a very difficult cohort of children, that they also have the right, the entitlement to what we would call powerful knowledge. By giving them powerful knowledge, we are also, by rights, doing something, even if it's a minor thing, to level the playing field across, from X high school in Great Yarmouth to the playing fields of Eton. And the better or powerful knowledge is specialised, and it takes the form of academic subjects. So we're not just talking about things that Boris Johnson might pull off the top of his head as being powerful knowledge, Theodotus or I don't know, I can't even think of any, but though that's not what we mean. That's what I call a pub quiz curriculum. And what we're saying is that this is specialised knowledge that fits into academic subjects. Not just kind of useless floaty facts that we can impress people with, or that might be useful at a pub quiz, or might be useful to kind of impress a date. This is a systematic approach to knowledge. This is, we have this body of knowledge, we pick it, we find it, we condense it, we distill it, we make it appropriate, we put it into these, if you want, silos of knowledge that we call subjects. But then obviously we can talk about how those silos aren't always a particularly good fit for knowledge. It's the basis of a curriculum that aims to be consistent with the disciplines where new knowledge is produced in universities and research institutes. And this is easy in some subjects, that you have a beautiful line from when you're teaching using pneumicons in reception, all the way through to people doing their PhD in number theory or something incredibly abstract that I probably don't even know about. You could say that's maths. There's a linearity to it, lots of offshoots from it. So you can, even by the time you get to A level, you're doing statistics and you're doing pure mathematics and you're doing algebra. But there's a linearity to it. Now, a little bit later, I'll talk about how RE doesn't have that linearity to it. There are multiple strains going off and backwards and forwards and all over the shop, and it's beyond wonderful and beautiful, and it's part of what makes RE so interesting. And I guess the same could be said of a subject like English. You've got your linguistics, you've got creative writing, all these different things. So some subjects are quite linear, and some subjects are more an amalgamation of different disciplines, different forms of knowledge and areas of knowledge. These are the questions that Christine Council puts forward, and you always want to listen to the questions that Christine Council puts forward because she knows what she's talking about. She says, who's best? Which is, that's not an easy question to answer, is it? In 2022, when we're living in a society made up of millions of different people from all around the world, and the children we teach in our classroom are from incredibly diverse viewpoints and backgrounds, and we want to reflect our national picture in our classroom. And when our national picture was fairly, almost, go back far enough, almost entirely monocultural, that was easy, and we could probably easily and uncontroversially in the Victorian period say what was best and what wasn't. We live in an age now where this is a huge question. Who's best? Who does that idea belong to? And we've got to make sure we're not uncritical and we just say, yeah, we're doing this because it's what they do at X school, or we need it because it's always been done. It's the traditional way of doing things. Where do we sit personally is really important to consider when we're doing any kind of curriculum planning. RE doesn't have a national curriculum. It has locally agreed syllabi, which my school, because we're an academy, and a lot of schools now, the majority of schools aren't obliged to follow. So as long as we're teaching something that looks like RE and that we could justify to Ofsted as RE and is deep diveable, we have a huge, colossal amount of freedom in terms of what we teach, what we choose, and that choice will be influenced by ourselves. So we need to be aware that, for example, I'm a practicing Christian, so I don't want to overload my curriculum with lots of stuff that I find interesting in Christianity because I'm a believer of Christianity with a cultural tradition of Christianity. I need to make sure that everything that's in there about Christianity is justified by like other things and is in there for the right reasons. Uh, Again, similarly with my interest in art history or architecture, if I'm including those elements, they're not tokenistic. That my interests are reflected, but they're not the only kind of guiding light for how we do this. And can there be neutrality? Well, I'll give you an easy answer: no, there can't, and there shouldn't be any attempt at neutrality. RE is not a neutral subject. We are not neutral teachers. Our children are not neutral receptors of knowledge. Our classrooms are not neutral spaces. Our schools are not neutral buildings. The communities that we live in and the broader national and international community is not a neutral place. So obviously, no, there can't be neutrality, but it doesn't mean these questions aren't important. And it doesn't mean that aiming for neutrality isn't important either. I'm not saying we can have a neutral curriculum. I'm not saying that, but I'm also not saying that we shouldn't aim towards trying to remove elements of bias and remove elements of discrimination or remove elements of like historical kind of colonial views of things. Knowledge is an entitlement and not a form of domination. And for me, this is probably one of the big things that I had to come to realize when I went through my transition early in my career from kind of very progressive teacher to quite traditionalist teacher is for me, tradition and domination were linked. And, the only way, this is years ago, I used to think this, the only way for people to escape from domination was to escape from tradition. So if we broke down all of the bad tradition, the things that oppressed people in this country and things that kept poor people poor and made rich people rich, we would somehow get rid of domination as well. And actually, I don't think that anymore. I think that things can become tradition and that tradition can be good and that we have a kind of cultural canon of knowledge and a national canon of knowledge and that children are entitled to access to that because some of those things are good and because some of those things are interesting and some of those things create opportunity and some of those things are enriching and some of those things are just good for their own sake. Learning, for example, Shakespeare or learning about the Bhagavad Gita. These are things that are good experiences for our children to have for their own sake, but also allow them access to further knowledge about Shakespeare. If you've read one Shakespeare play in a way that is guided, that with help and assistance and loving care and attention from an English teacher, then you might want to go on and read Coriolanus in your own time. So it opens doors to further experience of knowledge. That's part of the entitlement. And also it does do some of that kind of like what I don't want to attach his name to it because it's not helpful, but that kind of Boris Johnson bonhomie, what you might call cultural capital, ability to engage in conversations with people outside of your community, outside of your direct experience, gives you access to what I would call like a shared cultural narrative of the world. And RE is a big part of that because it aims to do that in Christianity and Buddhism and Hinduism and Sikhism and Judaism and Islam, non-religious worldviews and philosophy and ethics and all these different areas. It aims to give children a starting point there. Again, it aims to give children a way to have a conversation about all those different things, about 15 different worldviews, approaches, to the world. So I've spoken a bit about this, and this is going to lead into RE specifically, the issue here. So disciplines are how we find new knowledge. So, for example, archaeology is divided into kind of disciplinary knowledge and historical knowledge. So disciplines would be how we find new knowledge about things and what skills we use, and actually there are people out there who can explain this in a better way than I'm explaining it right now. So that's disciplinary, and then there's a whole historical body of knowledge that helps build up what archaeologists are doing. I'm not going to use this analogy again because it's wrong, but disciplines are how we find new knowledge, and subjects are how we order and transmit that knowledge, specifically in primary and secondary education, I would say, and maybe in some undergraduate education as well. So subjects are more about how we transmit knowledge that already exists. When we do a science experiment, we would hope that the outcome of that experiment is, broadly speaking, already known, and that we're doing it to kind of demonstrate certain skill set, and also because it's an interesting way to show the scientific process. That's not really finding new knowledge. We know that osmosis exists. The link is really interesting between how disciplines, how they feed down into subjects. And in something like chemistry, there's a fairly direct link. In history, there's a fairly direct link. But in RE, that is not so much the case. Subjects are the most reliable tool that we have for enabling students to acquire knowledge and to make sense of the world. And that, if you look at subjects in schools, they have been fairly fixed. RE has existed as an idea in schools. Well, I mean, you could go back to Aristotle and Plato and really that far back, and then you can go through the trivium and the quadrivium and the medieval period, and then you can look at something like the Education Act 1904 that established religious instruction, became religious education, is now merging into religion and worldviews. This is a reliable tool for transmitting information about religion, and it's the same. We've taught some form of history for hundreds of years. We've taught some form of what you might call oracy and writing and numeracy, and all of these things are hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of years old. They are the tools that we have to enable students to acquire knowledge. Now, some of what's been done in recent years, like project-based learning or topic learning, breaking down these subject boundaries, has been an attempt to say, no, actually, the best way to do things is through the use of through the use of generic skills. Problem solving, for example, is something that we can use across. You can use problem solving to solve a problem in maths, but then use those same generic skills to solve a problem in DT, and then use those same generic skills to attack an issue in RE. That's not a view that I have. I think that those 1,000-year-old boundary walls, if you want, between certain subjects are meaningful. I think the bodies of knowledge that we have built up in primary through curricula, national curricula, personal curricula, individual curricula are important, and that we should work within those boundaries, because those boundaries have meaning, that skills are not generic, that skills are more often the way that we apply knowledge that we've learned in individual subjects. So is RE a subject? Yes, it is a subject. At least in a legal sense, you are obliged to teach some form of RE, whether you work in a free school, an academy, a community school, a Catholic school, a Jewish school. You have to teach some form of RE. There's no national curriculum, but there is, through Ofsted and through the funding agreements that DfE has with schools, yes, RE is a subject, and yes, you have to teach it. That's easy. I have this analogy about RE that says that RE, because it's not a direct link between your discipline of RE and your subject of RE, because RE is often seen as, what's the word for it? People see RE as a bit of a dumping ground, really, a bit of a generic subject, something that doesn't have really clear boundaries, that I mean me and my fellow kind of passionate RE-ites and teachers of RE and RE leads and deputy heads and heads of academic study, whatever, need to, in some ways, create a defense of RE. So this is my analogy, and this is about horticulture and walled gardens. So if you've ever been to a National Trust property, I'm thinking of Mottisfont House in Hampshire, has a beautiful one, you might have come across this idea in garden planning of a walled garden. So you've got, you're walking through a big, vast sort of landscape of gardens, and then suddenly you come across a large, maybe it's like 12-foot tall brick wall that will surround a whole area of garden. And that, in my idea, is the boundaries of our subject. So these 12-foot walls are there to stop rats and rabbits and pests and the strong winds, and they're there to stop seeds being blown in and weeds being blown in. So they're a protective kind of defensive structure, and we need that in RE. We need to say, well, look, it's really interesting meeting you to talk about SMSC, but I don't think that we should be teaching about this new thing. I think someone was talking earlier about Mark Lahane's list of things that schools are constantly being told they should teach. Like money sense, for example, mortgages. I don't think we should be teaching this in RE. It's not part of RE. It's, citizenship is not part of RE, and learning about political processes, that's not part of RE, and learning about this is not part of RE. That's the defensive part that we need to do. And when we do that, we're saying that RE is this, and this. We have a clear idea of our subject, and that is the starting point for us to be able to go out into the world and use all of these incredible curriculum thoughts that we have to begin to create a narrative or a golden thread through RE or something like that. Now, what I didn't know about walled gardens that I've since learned is that wall is not just a defensive institution. The purpose of the wall is actually also to create a microclimate inside the walled garden. So if you go to Mottisfont on a sort of autumn afternoon, you'll find that inside the walled garden is often several degrees Celsius warmer than outside the walled garden. The walls absorb the sun's energy throughout the day. They keep the heat trapped inside the soil and inside the plants, and it dissipates a lot more slowly. So you would find it a lot easier to grow tomatoes, to grow orchids, to grow beautiful, slightly tropical flowers and interesting things inside your walled garden than outside it. And that sort of leads to the next part of the analogy, which is once we have these walls and we've been able to establish what is and isn't RE, and being able to stand up for our subject and say no to certain things or yes and include them within our walls, then we create a microclimate for growth in our subject. We create the ability to plan out in this defined area what we're going to do, how much of it we can cover, what plants we can include and what plants we can't include, what there's room for to learn in detail and what there's room for to learn in a cursory way. And actually thinking about the walled garden, we can begin to lay out from nursery, at least in a primary setting, all the way to year 6, but potentially all the way to year 13, a beautiful layout of all the different things that we're going to come back to, structure the whole curriculum. And I've had the privilege of being able to do that in my current school, of being able to write a curriculum that starts in year 1 and goes all the way through to year 6. And this analogy helped me to do that at the beginning, to think, what are the conditions for growth for our students? So what are students going to need to know in year 6, and how do we plant those seeds in reception? How do we plant those seeds in year 1 and then continue to come back to that throughout the curriculum? And when I wasn't worried about the walls being breached, when I wasn't worried about being asked suddenly to take on a certain element of something else, it was a lot easier to do, and it gave me a really clear visual identity for my subject. Now, is RE a discipline? Because really the walled garden kind of, in this analogy, is quite singular, right? It's one area as defined by a massive brick wall. So you think what you're doing in there is going to be pretty consistent. You're going to be just studying religion, right? That's what you do, or you're just going to study Christianity or whatever it is. Well, RE isn't like that, because RE is multidisciplinary in a really meaningful way of multidisciplinary, not just, we use computers in RE, or we do a bit of maths. It is properly multidisciplinary in the sense that it's well formatted, in that it takes on a lot of these different elements. So theology is where we ask questions about, even if you're not religious, you ask questions about what would it mean if God did exist, or kind of why is the existence of God so clear to some people and so clearly not the case to other people, and how do you construct a world in which God exists or doesn't exist? It's a fascinating subject. Religious studies is the kind of almost the external study of religious practices and how religious texts influence people, or religious beliefs influence people. So that's where we might look at like festivals, or we might look at stories, or I find it really interesting to look at how religious beliefs affect people's social action. So charity, giving, concern about things like climate change, all comes under religious studies. Art history is another one of these disciplines that has its own set of core understanding, its own set of skills, and yet I kind of claim that for RE, because using it as a lens through which to look at religion is so fascinating and so interesting. And when in a moment we come to look at some real lessons that I teach, you'll be able to see how art history feeds into them. More brilliant formatting. This PowerPoint is excellent. Philosophy is increasingly part of RE because it kind of, a lot of it offers a non-religious way into thinking about human existence. So we can ask really big questions about what we're doing here and why we exist, and start to think about things like philosophy of the brain or philosophy of thought, even with quite young age groups. But it is distinctive from theology because although there's a lot of crossover, a lot of philosophy is fairly secular. Sociology, so kind of links into what I was just saying about social action, but also about where communities exist and how they interact, how Britain has become a multicultural society. I mean, it's always one to some extent, but has become a much more multicultural society. How we can look at a map of London and look at the distribution of like Jewish communities, and how here I live in Southend in an area with lots of Orthodox Jewish people, and that's really interesting to me how they began life in, if you know where Bevis Marks Synagogue is, literally on the doorstep of Liverpool Street Station, in the very centre of London. And they moved out to Whitechapel, and then they moved out to Stepney, and they moved out further and further. And you find Jewish people now living all through this kind of route out of the East End of London up to Barking and to Upminster. And now so many Jewish people living in Southend because it's really it's still on that sort of eastern route out of London, but it's much cheaper. And in the 1970s, they built a synagogue in this neighbourhood, and it became a hub. And that's a kind of sociological look at Judaism in the local area. And modern studies, which is a really interesting one because I only came across modern studies when I was in a Waterstones in Glasgow, and I was looking through to see how different the Scottish revision guides were to the English ones, because I'm just a nerd and that's the kind of thing I like to do. And I came across this idea that you could do an equivalent of a GCSE in modern studies, which is kind of an amalgamation of like, I mean, we should do it in the UK, in England, really, but they do. They look at political systems. They look at how people can influence policy. They look at how Britain, how the kind of makeup of Britain. They look at historical change in Britain, things like that. So I kind of call it modern studies, but current affairs might be another word for it as well, like current affairs from the last kind of half century. Because of all of this is actually what our walled garden looks like. So this is somewhere in Devon, I think, but there is, an external wall here. So around the edge of the walled garden, we still have what we would call RE, but within it, there are all these different disciplinary areas. Now, what I really like about this analogy is that they're not closed off from each other. We're not got one walled garden, another walled garden, another one, and they're all set up with big high walls between them. Within the subject of RE, there's a real mix between these different subjects, both in terms of like a temporal mix, because we will do a bit of religious studies, a bit of sociology, a bit of philosophy, go back to religious studies, do a bit of theology. But also because what we learn about theology can then really influence what we know about, for example, reading the Bible, then that can really influence art history. And then when I say RE is truly multidisciplinary, these paths between the different subjects are what I mean. I mean that it's multidisciplinary by the very nature of its subject, from the ground up, from its construction. It's not an artificial thing. We don't have to, if we're planning good RE, we don't have to elbow in a bit of this here and a bit of that there. In recent years, it's become quite a thing to say we're now using a theological lens. We're now using an art history lens to look at something, and some people choose to make that really explicit in their planning, and that's really interesting to do. But it's not what I've chosen to do, because I think we're actually using an RE lens, which is kind of a mixture of all these different ones, and we want children to quite fluidly be able to swap between them. So anyway, clunky metaphor alert. I promise I'll try and... I've always tried to keep metaphors to a minimum when I'm writing and when I'm presenting, but that's the one metaphor that I do quite enjoy and that I allow myself. Does RE make sense? I think yes, it does. I think it is an interesting approach to lump all of these different disciplines together. But in terms of a subject, which makes sense in nursery, although I appreciate it's not part of the early years framework, but makes sense, okay, let's say makes sense in year one, and a subject that then makes sense to study at A level, and through which a through line can be found from one to the other, yes, it does make sense. And I'm happy to say that, otherwise I suppose I probably wouldn't be giving this talk. A more interesting question is, can we make sense of RE? So can we take these ideas and can we bring them into our classrooms and our schools in a way that is in any way, shape or form meaningful or good? So that's where meaning comes in. I love meaning. I think it's something that we don't talk about often enough in school is meaning. We love to talk about knowledge. We used to love to talk about skills, but actually meaning for me is, I don't know, it's something really special. It's kind of the missing ingredient. Okay, there is another analogy that I'm going to do that I love that will kind of illustrate meaning. So there was a hot dog factory in New York, and it was in Manhattan. It was in a really an area where the property values were really high. So the owner of this hot dog factory thought, we're going to make loads of money. We're going to preserve our future. We're going to sell our site in Manhattan, and we're going to move our factory to upstate New York, and it'll be absolutely brilliant. It's fantastic. And this hot dog factory in Manhattan kind of had a very loyal following of people who bought their meat from delis, like you might do in New York. They closed down, they demolished, they took all of their same equipment from their building. So they took their meat grinders and they took their casing makers and they took their sort of big chopping machine, and they shipped it on big trucks all the way to a beautiful new factory in upstate New York. And then they set their machinery going, they plugged it in, they had many of the same staff working there, they had the same suppliers, they had the same people, the meat came from the same farms, the casings came from the same factories, everything was the same, the packaging was exactly the same. And they started making sausages again. And then they noticed that people were not enjoying their sausages as much. They did not find the flavour to be the same. Delis were writing letters of complaint and saying something has changed. There was something about the old factory that made it really special and that gave those sausages their flavour. Not something really tangible that they could pick up and move, something that was just kind of an essence in the air, a third thing between the equipment and the meat that was not conceivable. And meaning in education is that you've got your knowledge and you've got your skills, and that's great, and you can mush them all together in your big sausage making machine. But ultimately, meaning is that kind of third thing that will make it stick. Meaning is the third thing that will make it important. Meaning is the third thing that makes it relevant and powerful. Meaning is incredible. And we get to do that with our students. That's the joy of teaching for me, is that I get to take knowledge, which I find really interesting, and I get to take skills, which I find really useful, and mush them together and add in this meaning. So what do I mean by meaning? Because I'm not talking about sausages. Meaning is linked to schema. And schema is this idea that a piece of knowledge doesn't sit independently within our brain, that it is inexorably linked to other pieces of knowledge. So Jesus, in the RE curriculum, should be linked through to sacrifice and the cross, Christianity, and Christianity is then, so you build up this huge web of knowledge, a web that we could never even begin to appreciate or document. I think some people have attempted to document it, but this is meaning, this is understanding of the world, is that knowledge is not independent, that it's structural, that it's part of something. That knowledge is also linked to the world as well, so that schema that we have is again, even that schema is not independent, that we go out into the world and it's like, yes, we can identify a cross, when it's drawn using two lines on a piece of paper, but then we also see it on churches and we understand that building as a church, or we might also see it in someone's house and make the connection that they are probably a Christian and that they have certain beliefs, and then we can have conversations about them, and that it's linked to the world. And that meaning is how we link knowledge to ourselves as well. So it's not just a case that we're building up a massive schema of knowledge that we can use externally, but meaning helps us to understand ourselves better. and ask questions of ourselves and be essentially better people. The more knowledge we have, the more broad our worldview is, the better we understand things, the better people we are. Which I understand is kind of controversial, and I don't really have an evidence base for saying that, but I just believe it. And sometimes it's fine to just believe things. That knowledge makes you a better person. Within this schema, you have your individual schema, but I also happen to believe that there are two other schema that links to. There's an institutional schema, and that's what we might say is our curriculum. One is probably pretty analogous to the other. An institutional schema is what we do in reception links to what we do in year 1 and 2, and a well-planned curriculum will not just be kind of documents on a page, but it will actually be this whole body of knowledge that we want our students to go through. If you sit down and map out everything a student does between the end of year 6 and the beginning of nursery or preschool even, it is pretty unbelievable and remarkable and amazing and incredible. Again, it's the joy of education that I just cannot get over enough. That is the institutional schema that we have. And there's also, I call it cultural. I guess that implies there might be multiple of these. I might call it global as well, or just what I mean is how what we learn in schools through tradition and canon and years of doing the same thing and studying the same people, how that enables you to link your own individual knowledge to the world at large, which might mean your street in Corby, or it might mean when you go to visit Hong Kong, or it might mean when you go and visit your family in Strathclyde or something like that. This is how what we learn, and in some ways new knowledge that we learn from outside, links into our individual. So I think there is a cultural scheme. I think there are things that are more important to Britain or more important to London or Huntingdon than there are. But again, as seems to be the case with all my third points, that's controversial and people have other opinions about that. So, concepts in teaching. Concepts are how we kind of mimic schema in our curriculum. Concepts are how we try to take what we want our students' heads to do in terms of making connections and meaning, and how we then take that and we put that onto the paper or the PowerPoint or into the booklet or the worksheet or the teacher's mouth or whatever method of transmitting information we have. In history, they are very fortunate. They have a wonderful they've been having this wonderful academic conversation for years about the different concepts that they have in history. Things like, for example, Stuart was talking about chronology earlier, so how one thing leads to another thing and how that's something that children need to understand, but also something like government. So, when you're talking about William the Conqueror, and establishing a government after the invasion of Britain, how that might link to a discussion of government in the Tudor period, and how it links to the suffragettes, and how it links to the idea of government in ancient Greece. That's another concept. So I just thought, I'll wholesale steal the idea of concepts from history because I love it. But then how does that apply to RE? Well, I had a go. So belief and doubt is a concept, isn't it? A kind of theological concept, if you want, but one that is at the very heart of what we do in RE. Some people believe in God or gods or, I don't know, a divine existence that's not a god, right? And some people really don't. And some people just aren't sure, and some people don't care, and some people are kind of 80-20 or 70-30 or whatever it is, right? And some people flip on a coin and some people go one way and the other. And that's really interesting because not only is it interesting that I think almost every adult probably has at some point in their life at least thought about this and formed part of their identity around this, but also because the students that we're teaching will be in that formative process. And, when I was in year 11, I was the fervent atheist, one of Richard Dawkins' most kind of God delusion bashing followers. And by the time I was in my early 20s, I was a recently baptized Christian. So that is something that I think the vast majority will come across. Orthodoxy and dissent. So within religions, to what extent can you be a fully orthodox Christian? Well, as I'll show you in a minute, it's really hard to the point where, unless you're the Pope and a practicing Catholic to believe this, it's impossible. And dissent. So then when do you choose to actively dissent from what you're being told by religious leaders, or what you're being told by religious tradition, or to some extent by religious texts, or by the words of Prophet Muhammad or Jesus? So that's a really interesting contrast, is between orthodoxy, trying to stick to what you've been told, trying to follow tradition, and dissenting from that. And many historical figures and many interactions between history and religion have been that dissent. Power and powerlessness, and I love this because, again, like it's really important in the story of Jesus's life and in Christianity in general, is the interaction between those who have power and those who don't. And we could mean power in the sense of a god that is powerful and humans that don't have that power. We could mean power in the sense of political power. We could mean power in the sense of religious power, but also like powerlessness. So charity comes into this, and giving money and helping people who are less fortunate than yourselves. And then beauty and destruction as well. So beauty and destruction is all about well, I'll show you how, in a very literal sense, how we do it in year 3. But beauty is essentially art and architecture, and it could be illuminated manuscripts, or it could be Islamic tile patterns or something like that. And that's kind of divine. It's kind of related to godliness and related to people's expression of their faith. And then destruction is kind of about power again. And it could be very literal. It could be like, the flood and Noah, or it could be something like the Holocaust, or it could be looking at World War II, or it could be destruction could also be like faithlessness, things like that. Anyway, these are 4 concepts. There are more concepts which I'm currently writing about and thinking about to help work out how we bring meaning into RE. So I thought what I'd do for the last maybe like 10-15 minutes of this talk is just show you some of the planning that I've done and talk about how each bit of planning represents concepts. So I know there was a bit of chat earlier about PowerPoint. I love PowerPoint. I do all my planning on PowerPoint. Essentially, given the choice between writing planning into a Word document or structuring a lesson through PowerPoint, I always use PowerPoint. And there's often booklets that go with these as well. But these are real kind of slides and examples from lessons that I've planned to talk about. So we'll start with belief and doubt, because one of my favourite questions as a primary school RE lead and planner and teacher, whatever you want to call me, is this question about how do you get a year 1 or reception age student to understand the most fundamental category of sort of thing in RE, which is some people believe in God and they can't prove who God is, and they can't take a photo of God, and they can't show you any kind of scientific proof for God necessarily, but they just believe in God. And that's just what they believe. And some people don't, and they doubt it. And that God exists in this category outside of true and false, that binary, outside of fiction and non-fiction, that Jesus is not, I always say, not the same as, like Iron Man or another superhero. That, yeah, there are category similarities because miracles are quite similar to, superpowers, but trying to get young children to understand that Jesus stands in a third category, that Jesus stands outside of what they've so far been led to understand. Everything in the world is either true. This third category is really interesting. So these are some slides from, I think, a year 1 scheme of work about Islam, where the idea behind these slides is they act as kind of almost like a script for teachers to guide a conversation with students that, in my view, I think Key Stage 1 teachers are really well equipped to have these conversations, and that if we can guide them through them, that's the best way of doing it, rather than saying that children need to know X, Y, and Z, and your job is to just teach them. That having it as a conversation structure, or having it as a discussion, or having it as kids questioning what is on the slides or questioning what you've told them is, I guess you'd call it a dialogical sort of approach, works really well in Key Stage 1. So you'd start with something like this. Muslims cannot see Allah, which is the Arabic name for God. They cannot touch Allah. They cannot prove to other people that Allah exists, but they have a belief in Allah. And that's trying to get to that third stage of like, it's not fiction, it's not fact, it's something in between. For some people, it's really so close to being fact, it might as well be fact. For some people, it's so close to being fiction, it might as well be fiction. But there's this middle gap between those two ideas. Some Muslims say Allah is like the wind. You can't see the wind, you can't take a photo of the wind, but you can feel it and you can see the effects that it has. An analogy that I really like, which is if you spoke to most Islamic and Christian and Jewish scholars, would say for X, Y, and Z reasons is really heretical or inaccurate or just not helpful. But when we're adapting complex ideas to year one students, sometimes we need to be brave enough to be a little tiny bit heretical. So sometimes we need to suspend our fidelity to that academic discipline outside of our subject and just say in year one we're just going to say that Allah is like the wind, and when we come back and study it in year 7 or when we come back and study it in year 13, we can talk in a lot more depth about kind of this category of God and what they're like. But for now, this is useful as an analogy, and we're going to stick with it, knowing that we have until at least year 6 to come across this again and discuss it in some more detail, hoping that when they go off to secondary, they'll have it at least until year 11 or year 13. Muslims never draw or paint pictures of Allah. This is because they think that Allah is too special to be able to draw. A painting or drawing would never be good enough. And then we use art, so we look at it. Well, okay, if Christians do draw pictures of Jesus and Moses and Abraham and whatever, what do Muslims do instead? Do they just worship in a big white box? Well, no, they don't, and we know that. How do they show their devotion to God, their belief in Allah? How do they show that? Through these different means. And we come back to this Islamic art is a theme that runs through our teaching of Islam. We're always trying to link the visual to the abstract in order to create something that is almost like a hook for children. So they think about calligraphy, and then they might remember the importance of the Quran and Quranic verse and the hadith to Muslims, and just this idea that if I was showing this to a class, try and get them to imagine what it might be like to be a really poor farmer. I think this is in Uzbekistan, from a dusty land, who'd never seen a big building before and never been somewhere decorated, had always lived in a tent with their camel. One day they come into the big city and they see this, and how do they feel looking up at that? And why is it special? Why is it interesting? What do you spot about it? And then we can talk about how Islamic tile patterns tessellate, and so they continue forever. And that's kind of reflection of the Islamic idea that God or Allah exists and goes on forever. And then calligraphy and introducing just what Arabic looks like, so that again they can identify it, make a link in their schema between Arabic and Islam, and then year 1, that's a basic link, isn't it? But then you can start to build on different ideas. So in year 6 we look at Jerusalem, and you can say, well, look, there's Hebrew, there's English, there's Arabic. Why are these languages all here? What's the importance of Arabic? And then we can link it to how the Quran was revealed to Muhammad, and why Muslims learn Arabic, and why they recite the Quran in Arabic, and why they don't use translations of the Quran. All hooked on this idea that Arabic and Islam are connected. So orthodoxy and dissent, we look in year 5. One of my favourite schemes of work is the question about Christianity and war. So why do some Christians decide to go to war, and why are some Christians, or in this specific case Quakers in particular, why are they pacifists? So what is the orthodox position there? What is the dissent? Well, it's not as clear as it might seem, because we look at quotes from the New Testament and the Old Testament. So there's this incredible scene where Jesus is being arrested, and Matthew 26, he says, one of his disciples chops off the ear of a Roman soldier, and he says, "Put your sword back in its place." Jesus said, "For all those who live by the sword die by the sword." And we talk about Christianity and the cycle of violence, and Jesus wanted to end it using forgiveness. But then we look at Exodus, an equally important part of the Bible for Christians who believe that the Bible is the word of God or inspired by God. Right there it says, if there's serious injury, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Wow. Okay, so Christians just follow the Bible, right? They just go to the Bible, they go to the index, and they go war. Okay, go to the and then they read these two things, and there's two more things down here that are completely contradictory. So this links into the previous unit that we've done, where we look at Aquinas and we look at Augustine, and we look at conscience, and we say both of those people said you need to read scripture, but also listen to your conscience, but also use your voice of reason. So we would link that in with this. But then it kind of destroys this idea that you can be a totally orthodox Christian who is both simultaneously vengeful and wants to right the wrongs in the world, but also a pacifist who turns the other cheek. So we look at Quakers in quite a lot of detail, who are pacifists, who believe that violence is always wrong, and they oppose war and violence. And we look at the historical precedent for this, a meeting taking place in the Vietnam War outside of the White House. We look at their method of worship in silence and allowing God to kind of infuse that silence. Children find Quakerism fascinating. I mean, I always have personally, and maybe because I share that interest, that's why. But Quakerism has come from a descent from the orthodoxy of Christianity, but it really interests them that people seek out silence, because so much of what they experience in school is having silence imposed on them, or when is the next opportunity to not be silent? And this idea that you would go for an hour to be silent is really interesting. I mean, maybe it's just interesting to me as a teacher because it's so infrequent. And then we look at a modern example of Quakers blocking lorries at the annual sort of arms fair exhibition that takes place at the XL Exhibition Centre. We might watch a news report about this, or we might talk about the scale of it, or we might look at the news report from last year and see how many people had been arrested, or things of that nature. And then we look at chaplains who choose to go to war. So they are military members of the armed forces, who actually decide that they want to minister to people at war. Obviously, they're not combat trained themselves, but they choose to go out and minister to those people who have chosen to be a Christian and also to fight and kill for their country. So here's a picture from World War II of a Catholic priest blessing people who are about to be sent out on naval vessels. And then we bring those two ideas together. I've really shortened this. This is part of a whole unit, really, looking at this. So this is just a recap lesson, really. But you bring together your Quakers and your military chaplain, who are both Christians, and you kind of want to say, well, which one of them is Orthodox and which one of them is dissenting? Because the Quakers would say the chaplain is dissenting, the chaplain would say the Quakers are dissenting. And that's why this is a difficult concept, really, because there is no strict orthodoxy in Christianity. But also focus on what they agree on. They both agree that Jesus is the Son of God. They both agree that we should listen to what it says in the Bible, and they both agree that that Jesus's words are important and that we should listen to them, but they clearly interpret them quite differently. Power and powerlessness. So this is a good example of using art history to illustrate one of these themes, because I love bringing in paintings, sculpture, whatever. I particularly love Caravaggio and the Renaissance paintings. If you showed this to one of my students, they would immediately say, look at where that light is, look at how Jesus's face is illuminated by light, but how Judas, if we say this is Judas to the right here, Judas is a much darker figure. In fact, Judas's face almost seems to put Jesus's face in the shade. And then looking at the expression on their faces, the action, what's happening, how Jesus doesn't look defiant, Jesus doesn't look pained, he looks sad, he looks like he knows what's going to happen. His hands are clasped together, they're not reaching around someone's neck, they're not reaching for a dagger. All of this is really interesting because Jesus in this painting is not powerful. Jesus isn't performing a miracle. Jesus isn't. This is Jesus, sort of human Jesus. There's this idea in Christianity that Jesus is fully human and fully divine, but you really, Christ Pantocrator kind of does it, but you can't illustrate that in a painting. In most paintings, I think you'll you're looking at a divine Jesus or you're looking at a human Jesus. And I find the human Jesus really interesting. Here's a brilliant painting. I love talking about Jesus in the temple with my students, because children have this idea that Jesus is really calm and loving. And, we used to have a picture at home that had Jesus with lambs and children by his feet, listening to him talk. And then these paintings from of Jesus in the temple, where he's got a whip and he's furious, and there are people being bodily hurt by him, and he's throwing over tables and he's chucking stuff out. That's a very different image of Jesus, and that's Jesus full of human power as well as divine power. And then we look at the power of nature, and we look at how Christians, or any religion really, might look at a painting like this and say, well, I can see God in this painting. I can see the power of God in nature. And kind of comes up at GCSE level, really, talking about creation, but also how Christians see God through acts of divine kind of natural worship. So this comes from a Key Stage 3 scheme that I wrote. This is probably one of my favourite paintings of all time. Again, a very human Jesus, a very powerless Jesus, being taunted by Pontius Pilate, saying, who are you? You say that you're the Son of God, and yet blah, blah, blah. We know what happens in the story. Jesus is obviously matching my beard, looking very scraggly and very unkept. Really interesting to compare that with other paintings of Jesus. Here's, Jesus' Descent from the Cross by Raphael. Really, I could probably talk for an hour about kind of Jesus in Renaissance paintings. So trying to drop that in there. Beauty and Destruction. This is from a year 3, possibly year 2 scheme of work, looking at the history of Christianity in London. We can almost see St Paul's Cathedral from our school, so this constitutes kind of local study for us. Learning about religious architecture in terms of just the names of things, like this is a nave, this is a spire, but also like look at the other buildings around here. This is this is the medieval period, late medieval period. How important is Christianity to these people that a huge section of the very dense centre of their city is a church, not just a little priory church, but in fact the tallest building in Europe at the time, in the centre of London. So how would it have felt when it burnt down? Might that have made you question your faith, question your religion, your belief in God? And here's London after the Great Fire. How many churches were there? How did people feel that their local church would have been lost? What would that have been about? This is linking in with history, obviously. Here's Wren's plan for London. There are two real centres for his plan that show the importance of at the time. On the left is St Paul's Cathedral, which, as we know, was rebuilt by Wren, and we look at that. But on the right also, now money is creeping in as well, because look, there's a bank and a mint, there's a post office, there's the Guildhall and the goldsmiths, all clustered around what is arguably a much more important centre than St Paul's. So you've got these two contrasting places in the rebuilding of London. And then here is St Paul's Cathedral. They've replaced, this vast Gothic cathedral with this vast Baroque cathedral, and it's amazing to think how this was built in a time period before computer-aided design, or before you could just whack something into CAD and create it. This is the amount of skill is amazing. And here it is during World War II, a symbol of beauty amongst the ruins, a symbol of defiance, a symbol of London rising above the flames, and how it was so important to morale. And you can question again what it would have meant if St Paul's Cathedral did succumb. And so I know I've literally only got 1 minute left, and I was really worried this wouldn't stretch for an hour. Clearly this is an hour-long talk. How do we do this then? So we create a curriculum that is full of connections, because those connections are the difference between knowledge and meaning. We communicate the connections explicitly to ourselves, to our students, in our planning, to other people. We create a curriculum full of what is beautiful and important, and then we don't do that uncritically, because those two words have such huge amounts of baggage attached to them in 2022, or really at any point, that you need to think carefully about what we mean by beauty and importance. Look after your walls and your flowers. Don't let people dump stuff in RE. Don't let it become unloved. Make sure it has specific time on the curriculum. Make sure you have an RE lead who cares about it, whether that's at a school level or a trust level. And don't do it alone. I wrote an entire curriculum during COVID from year 1 to 6, and it was great. I loved it, except that sometimes I hated it and it made me miserable. And I think it's really important to make connections, and that's why Tadape is so wonderful, and that's why Twitter has been so wonderful, and that's why the community that we've built is so wonderful, because you don't have to do these things alone. You can speak to me, you can speak to Stuart, you can speak to Neil, you can speak to whoever you want to speak to. They're out there and they've got time, and they're wonderful people, except me, who's not a wonderful person. And yeah, that's really the key takeaway here: is don't do things alone that you find difficult. Yeah, so that's me. Look at that. It's 1700. Can't believe that took an hour.